All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Tuesday. I guess it's 2/22/22, so welcome to that. We are back for week number 5 of PPA 500, so I hope everyone is doing well and that your week is off to a good start. Before we get into our material for tonight, first, thank you for your draft advancement to candidacy forms. Those that have been submitted, I have reviewed and then returned some feedback to you. Just a couple of quick comments, just a couple of quick reminders, I guess they are, is on the advancement form, always make sure that all your core courses will be completed before you register for 697. So make sure all those semesters for core courses predate the semesters in which you are going to register in 697. Another quick reminder is remember you need to have 5 electives in addition to the core courses. And as we had talked about in our first session, as was discussed in the orientation session, those 5 courses can either come from within the Graduate Center, within the MPA program, or they may come from departments across campus. But if you do want to take a course outside of the MPA program as an elective, you should talk with Dr. Matthews about that, and she can help you in terms of either finding the correct class to take or can help you get into a course that you've already identified, since some of those programs and some of those departments across campus are impacted and open only to their own majors. And then finally, if you do need to do the internship, remember that the internship, you do it as part of a course, PPA 585. And the PPA 585 is a 3-unit course, but those 3 internship units cannot count towards your 39-unit degree requirement for the MPA degree. So if you have to do an internship or register for PPA 585, those 3 units are going to be in addition to your 39-unit requirement. So you'd essentially have a 42-unit requirement if you need to complete an internship. That's a regulation from NASPA, our accrediting body, and they're pretty firm on that. And so those 3 units are then beyond your 39-unit requirement. But thank you for those. Hopefully, I provided feedback that will then help you. Once you are ready to advance, you can go ahead and advance. Again, you'll be ready to advance once you've completed 6 units in the program with a cumulative GPA of at least 3.0. So thank you for those. Coming up on Monday, the 28th, you have a couple of assignments that are due. The one assignment obviously is the midterm assessment, and we spent some time in class last week going over the midterm assessment. I went through each of the scenarios and each of the questions with you. That midterm assessment is available on the Beachboard site. Hopefully you've been working on it. Once we finish our material for tonight, in fact, the first half of class tonight, you will have all the information you need to do all 5 scenarios. And so we'll give you that information tonight to do that final scenario on theoretical approaches to public administration. So you have that due next Monday. And then you also have your 3rd Beachboard essay that's also due next Monday. Again, in that Beachboard essay, what you're going to be doing is comparing public and private organizations. And so for the organization you're currently working in, or perhaps an organization you're interested in, if you're not currently working in an organization, you'll take that organization and compare it to a similar private sector organization. And you'll talk to me about what are 2 similarities between your public organization and a private sector organization, and then what are 2 main differences between your public organization and a similar private sector organization. If you're currently working in the private sector, then obviously just reverse the logic and you'll be comparing your private organization to a public organization. So again, in doing that Beachboard essay, you're going to be drawing off of the Graham Allison article that we discussed last week, talking about similarities and differences between public and private sectors and public and private sector organizations. So please be mindful of those 2 assignments that are due next week so that you can plan your time accordingly. It's kind of a heavy workload this week compared to last week, since last week you were just working on the draft advancement to candidacy form. So it's really important to plan out your time and manage your time appropriately. Are there any questions or anything at all before we get into our material for tonight? Okay. As you are working on the midterm assessment throughout this week, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I am back in town as of yesterday, so I am local and will be able to return your email very quickly. So just let me know if you have any questions. Okay, for tonight, what I'd like to do is kind of extend where we left off last week. So in class last week, we talked about the idea of public administration and the study of public administration. We talked about Woodrow Wilson and his article. We talked about the importance of Wilson's approach of politics administration dichotomy, and then the reality of the politics administration dichotomy, that there really isn't this clear line of demarcation between the political side and the administrative side, and that administrators actually get involved in politics in the formulation of policy as well. But what Woodrow Wilson does for us in that article, the primary utility of that article, is it presents to us the importance of studying administration and studying administration as a field of study, as something that we can analyze. And that if we look at administration as a field of study, something we can analyze, we can then make, as Woodrow Wilson would say, the business of government more efficient. So this whole idea of public administration perhaps being a discipline really does flow out of that argument made by Woodrow Wilson all the way back in 1887. We also discussed this whole idea of a discipline and what makes an academic discipline. And I think we established last week that to be an academic discipline, you need to differentiate yourself from other fields of study. There needs to be something unique about the way in which you go about researching your phenomena. There must be something unique about your topic or your area of study, the norms and expectations of how you go about collecting data and arriving at conclusions. There needs to be some distinction, some uniqueness in order to truly be an academic discipline. And then I'm leaving it up to you to form your own opinion as to whether or not public administration is a discipline or merely a field of study. But since we are in a public administration program, at this point in the class, we're going to work from the assumption, and accept the assumption that public administration is indeed an academic discipline. If it is indeed an academic discipline, then that would suggest for us that it has its own theories and schools of thought that it has developed in order to explain phenomena and to explain relationships between different types of variables in our environment. So academic disciplines develop theories. So what are some of the theories that have developed over the past 150 or so years in this academic discipline of public administration? And the first half of class tonight, that's what we're going to devote our attention to: the development of theoretical approaches to studying public administration. And as we talked about last time, when we talk about studying public administration, most administration occurs within public sector organizations. So by definition, the study of public administration is very much the study of public organizations. So our discussion of theoretical perspectives on administration will focus on theories that will help us understand our public organizations. And so the vast majority of these theories we talk about tonight in the development of public administration literature focus squarely on public sector organizations, or at least the application to public sector organizations. So the way in which I like to introduce these theoretical perspectives on public administration is to do it in a chronological fashion. Because I think if we can kind of generally follow that chronology, we can really see how the theories and the literature in public administration have developed over the years. Because again, we're going to back our discussion up into the late 1800s and bring it up to our contemporary period of time. Now, we have an entire standalone class, PPA 660, Organization, Theory, and Behavior, that focuses on these types of public administration theories. And so what we're going to do tonight in 500 is we're going to just kind of hit that tip of the iceberg. We're going to introduce these theories and these different schools of thought so you have a working familiarity with them and kind of an understanding of how the theoretical perspectives have really developed over the past 150 years. Then when you move into PPA 660, you'll really start to delve into the details of a lot of these theories and these schools of thought. So the way in which I like to do is, again, look at it chronologically. So when we start talking about chronologically, we're going to start with the first real school of theories. And that first school of theories is what's known as the classical school. The classical school, we're really kind of backing up again to the 1800s. And here we're looking at from the late 1800s into the 1930s. The classical school, the classical approach to studying public organizations. And there are a lot of authors who are part of this classical approach to studying organizations. Because we're in the 500 course, we're not going to talk about all of them, but we're going to highlight three of the most, I hate to use the word important, but the most long-lasting types of theorists in this school of thought, the ones that you always cover in public administration programs. And those three individuals are Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, and Luther Gulick. And again, this is not a universal discussion of the entire universe of classical theorists. We're just going to highlight three of the primary classical theorists. So let's start our discussion of the classical school of public organization theory with Max Weber. Now, Max Weber was not a public administrator. He was not a public administration theorist. He was a sociologist, but we borrow liberally from other disciplines, as we talked about before. Public administration as a discipline is very interdisciplinary. We borrow from sociology and psychology and business and criminal justice sometimes, engineering. We borrow physics. We borrow from all different types of disciplines. So what Weber talked to us about with organizations is his primary goal of his organization theory was to try and make our organizations as effective as they could possibly be. So Weber's primary goal was organizational effectiveness. The way that Weber thought we achieve organizational effectiveness is through the structure of our organization. If we can structure our organizations in this, what he called ideal bureaucracy, if we can create the ideal bureaucratic organization, then that ideal bureaucratic organization can be both effective as well as efficient. So for Weber, it was really a one-size-fits-all approach, that he thought he could come up with the characteristics of an ideal bureaucratic structure, and then you could apply that ideal bureaucratic structure across every organization, and thus make every organization effective and efficient. So for Weber, his ideal bureaucracy was one that had all the characteristics listed on the screen. Number one characteristic is a tall hierarchy. This is this pyramidal shape to your organizational structure, where you have one person at the top of the organization. Then as you descend down the levels of the organization, your pyramid kind of spreads out and you encounter more and more and more employees. And the largest number of your employees are going to be at the bottom of the organizational structure. So that pyramid is what's called a tall hierarchy. He really was a big believer in making our organizations into tall hierarchies. The second ideal bureaucratic principle was division of labor. We need to divide up the work. So our organizations have a lot of things they need to accomplish on a daily basis. So we can become more efficient by dividing the work up among all the different members of our organization. So we divide up the work. So this person will deal with budgeting. This person will deal with hiring personnel. This person will deal with providing services to citizens. Everyone has their own set of tasks. Each one of those individuals who have their own set of tasks will then specialize in those tasks on a daily basis. When you specialize in the same tasks and you do the same types of jobs every single day, you then obviously will become an expert on how to do those tasks well. Specialization of tasks then leads to his fourth principle of expert status. When you specialize in these tasks every single day, you become very adept at doing these tasks. You become the expert on how to do these jobs on a daily basis. So then our ideal bureaucratic organization is therefore staffed by experts in their fields. In this ideal bureaucratic structure, we also then have what he calls unity of command. So we've got this pyramidal shape, again with this tall hierarchy. Everyone is responsible to someone above them. Everyone is held accountable by someone above them. And then that person's held accountable to someone above them, and so on until you get to the very apex of the organization where you have that one singular organizational leader. That's what's known as a unity of command. So you've got this chain of command. Within this unity or chain of command, you also then have what Weber called span of control, that every supervisor is responsible for a limited number of subordinates. So as a supervisor, you may have 3 or 5 or 7 people who report to you, but you are not responsible for everyone underneath you in the organization. You have your identified subordinates, and those are the folks who then you are responsible for. The people, the bureaucrats who populate this bureaucratic organization, are professional, career-oriented employees. They're professionals, they're highly skilled, and they view working in this organization as a career. They're in this organization for the long term. They're not planning on bouncing from this organization to another and to another. They're looking at this organization as their career for life. And everything we do in the organization, according to Weber, needs to be documented. So everything the organization does on a daily basis is based upon written documentation. So we have written rules and processes and procedures. The benefit of having written rules and procedures is you can then establish some uniformity in the way in which you are treating individuals. So if we have a policy and procedure manual and we stick to those policies, those procedures, then we'll be able to make sure that we're treating all of our employees equally, that we're treating all of our citizens equally. It allows for the protection of individual rights. And it also then creates that institutional memory, so that when these employees retire, they're then replaced with new employees. Those new employees don't come into the organization without any knowledge of how the organization operates. They have this written documentation. They have these policy and procedure manuals that they can then follow in doing their daily tasks. So Weber felt if we could create organizations that met this ideal structure of all these different characteristics that we talked about, then we could have effective and efficient organizations. So it was very much a one-size-fits-all approach, focused on effectiveness and efficiency. The disadvantage, obviously, of Weber's ideal bureaucracy is there's not a lot of discussion, if any, of your personnel, of the wants, needs, and desires of your individual employees. The employees were just placed in this organization, expected to follow their rules and regulations, expected to report to whomever they were accountable to, expected to do their tasks that they were assigned on a daily basis. Not a lot of self-governance, not a lot of self-determination, not really much recognition of employees as actually being human beings with their own wants, needs, and desires. And that is a common criticism of all of the classical theorists, whether it be Weber or Taylor or Gulick. They really overlooked that human element of our organizations. But Max Weber's contribution is just that, this ideal bureaucratic structure, this one-size-fits-all type of an approach. A second classical theorist is Frederick Taylor. And Frederick Taylor did much of his writing for the private sector, and then we took those theories for private sector organizations, and we then applied them to public sector organizations, most prominently to federal bureaucratic agencies. Now, we know from Graham Allison and our reading of Allison that there's some limitation to taking theories that apply to private organizations and using them in public organizations, because there are some distinctive differences in how we do our jobs in the public sector versus how we do our jobs over in the private sector. But Frederick Taylor was similar to Weber in that he shared this idea of the one-size-fits-all approach. He thought we could develop one generic theory and then apply that theory across all organizations, public and private, in order to make those organizations effective and most especially make them efficient in doing their daily tasks. He also shared with Weber the lack of concern over employees, but it was even more obvious with Frederick Taylor. If you go back and you read Frederick Taylor and you read some of his ancillary works, he talks about employees in a very negative light. He talks about employees as being what he calls boorish beasts. He basically says they're boorish beasts. They need to be told what to do. They cannot be trusted to figure out what to do on their own. He also referred to employees as being cogs in the machinery. So whenever you have a machine and you've got cogs, one cog then pushes against another cog, and a tooth of one cog will push against the tooth of another cog, and that's what makes the machinery turn and make the machinery work. Well, if one of the cogs has a broken tooth, it's no longer going to make the other cog turn, so it's defective. So you take out that cog, you throw it away, you replace it with a new cog. For Taylor, that was his approach to people. If someone was not getting the job done, rather than training them and giving them opportunities to improve their performance, you just get them out of the organization and you replace them with someone who can do the job. So again, a very negative view of employees. Where Taylor and Weber differ is that Weber wanted to create effective organizations through the structure of the organization, whereas Taylor wants to create effective and efficient organizations, not necessarily through structure, but through the process of work. So he was very process oriented in how he was going to create effective and efficient organizations. He is best known for the theory of scientific management, which you have probably heard about before. He would literally look for what he called the one best way to do a job. So he believed through scientific management, we could do these time motion studies, whereby he could actually take a stopwatch and stand behind someone while they were doing a job and time every single one of their movements. And so the classic example was a very simple job of shoveling pig ore into a cart. So he would stand behind the employee would have a shovel, the employee would put the shovel into the pig ore, pick the pig ore up, move the pig ore over, and dump it into the cart. Go back, do it over again, and repeat those actions throughout the entire day. He would stand behind them in his time motion study with a stopwatch, and he would time every single element of the job. So he would time how long it took the employee to put the shovel into the pile of pig ore, how long it took the employee to pick the shovel full of pig ore up, how long it took the employee to then move that shovel full over to the cart, how long it took them to dump it into the cart, how long it took them then to reset, and to go back to the pile and start over again. The idea of deconstructing your jobs down into their component elements was, again, what was known as scientific management, these time motion studies, but the purpose of it was to eliminate what he called false movements. So any movement that the employee was doing that did not contribute to getting the job done efficiently, you want to eliminate those false movements and then collect all the good movements together, all the productive movements together into what he called the one best way to do the job. And he believed that we could identify a singular best way to do every single job in our organization. We could then train our employees how to do that job in that single best way, monitor their performance to make sure that they are doing it in that one best way every single day, and that would then create an efficient and effective organization for us. Now, it kind of makes sense kind of from that efficiency type of perspective, but again, he didn't care much about the individual employee. The individual employee was just a cog that could be replaced in the organization. And that was the primary criticism of scientific management. But despite those criticisms, scientific management is still alive and well, even in our modern public organizations today. In your organization, you probably have a position description that describes the types of duties that you are doing on a daily basis and will probably allot a percentage of time every day that you will spend doing those different duties. The whole idea of being able to have a job description comes from the deconstruction of work in scientific management. Your position description then leads to a position classification system. And you probably have a classification for your position. That classification places you in the classification chart, and then based upon where you fall in that classification chart, your compensation then gets assigned to you, assigned to your job based upon where you fall in that chart. So if someone else has a more responsible job that requires additional skills more so than your job, they'll probably have a higher classification level and will then get compensated more than you're getting compensated for your job. So the whole idea of creating job descriptions, the whole idea of having position classification systems, we can really thank scientific management for that. And we see both of those things prominently in our modern day organizations. So despite the deficiencies of scientific management really did have a very profound impact upon public organizations today. So we started with Weber, focused on structure. We then went to Taylor. He focused on work processes. Now a third author in this classical school of public organization theory is Luther Gulick. And Luther Gulick differs from Weber and Taylor in some important ways. One important way is that Gulick actually took his theories and applied them to the federal government. Now, Weber and Taylor weren't writing for public organizations, but their theories eventually got applied. Gulick took a lot of his theories and directly himself, as part of the Brownlow Commission and the reorganization of the federal government in the 1930s, applied his theories directly to federal agencies. So there's much more of a nexus here with the public sector with Luther Gulick. Another way in which he differs is that for Luther Gulick, his focus was very much on skills and what he called principles. So Gulick would argue that there are certain core principles that all managers need to do in their organizations. If we could teach these managers how to do these core principles, we could essentially create what he would call a managerial toolkit. And we could provide that managerial toolkit to our managers. And then whenever they ran into a problem and they had to do something in their organization, they could go back to their toolkit and they could pull out the appropriate principle and apply that appropriate principle to that problem in that organization. This whole principles approach to managing organizations is very similar to what we know in public administration as the generic management approach. You know, we talked about Graham Allison. Graham Allison said that there are certain things all managers do, regardless of whether they're in the public or the private sector. That's generic management theory. It doesn't matter what sector they are in. But what Allison told us is the difference is in how those principles are then carried out between the sectors. So Gulick says these principles, this managerial toolkit, consists of these generic management functions of planning. All managers have to plan the operations of their organization. Organizing, we all have to organize resources within our organization and decide what the organizational chart's going to look like and what types of positions report to what other positions in our organizations. All managers do staffing. We all have to bring employees into the organization, allocate work among those employees, evaluate the performance of those employees. We all do this staffing function. All managers are engaged in directing, in that they direct the efforts of people who are under them in the organizational chart. All managers engage in coordinating, especially for larger organizations. You have all these different positions and these different units and departments. And they may be going in different directions. So you need to coordinate their efforts to make sure that all their efforts are working together to meet the goals of the organization. We all do reporting. We have to report on what we are doing and how well we are doing it. And then we all engage in budgeting. Organizations simply cannot operate unless they have the requisite revenue to make their expenditures. If you don't have that revenue, money is the lifeblood of an organization. The organization's not going to be around very long. So planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting are the principles known as, by the acronym POSCORE. So sometimes you'll hear people refer to Luther Gulick as the principal school. Sometimes people refer to him as the creator of the POSCORE school. Those terms are used interchangeably. But he really felt that we could take all these principles, teach these principles to our managers, create a managerial toolkit, and then those managers could use that managerial toolkit to make their organizations effective and efficient. Where Gulick shares similarities with Taylor and Weber is that he also was focused on a one-size-fits-all approach to making our organizations effective. This principal school was his one-size-fits-all approach. So for Weber, it was the ideal bureaucratic structure. For Taylor, it was the one best way to do the job. For Gulick, it was these principles that we could teach our managers in our organizations. But again, Gulick, like Weber and Taylor, didn't talk a lot about individual employees and their wants, needs, and desires, and really also overlooked the human element. Now, he wasn't quite as obvious about overlooking the human element as Taylor was. He didn't call people boorish beasts and cogs in the machinery. But I think the unifying concept between all these classical school theorists is that they really didn't focus much on the human element and really overlooked the importance of human beings as employees within our organization. But what ties them all together is the search for the one best way to make our organizations efficient and effective. So that kind of takes us into the 1930s. But because of those criticisms of the classical school, that classical theorists overlooked the human element of our organizations, we then had the impetus for developing new theories and new schools of thought to try and remedy those problems in the classical school. And one of the things you'll see as we look at this development of the public organization theory literature is that new schools of thought and new theories are usually developed as what we call rejoinders to previous schools. So as a response to a criticism of a previous school. So the neoclassical schools, as we like to call them, are those schools of thought that were developed to try and remedy the deficiencies in the classical school. And there are several different neoclassical schools of public organization theory. Because we are 500 and we have limited time and scope in this class, we're not going to cover all the neoclassical schools, but some of the more important ones that we will cover tonight are schools such as the Human Relations School, the School of Human Resource Management, the School of Systems Theory, and then there are also what we consider more modern schools such as Quality Management, Organizational Culture, and Leadership. But again, because we have limited time tonight, we're only going to touch on a few of these neoclassical schools and talk about some of the authors within those neoclassical schools. So let's start with the Human Relations School. So the most immediate response to the classical school and the problems identified in the classical school was the growth and evolution of this thing known as the Human Relations School. The Human Relations School really developed in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, again, to address the human element of our organizations that classical theorists had overlooked for years. The first author I usually like to talk about when I talk about the Human Relations School is Mary Parker Follett. And we have to add a caveat here in that we talk about Mary Parker Follett as a human relations theorist, but she actually predated the Human Relations School. Human Relations School really didn't start to take on a lot of steam until the 1930s and 40s and 50s. Follett was actually writing before that period of time. Follett was writing at the heyday of scientific management in the 1920s. So in the 1920s, scientific management just exploded, and it just spread like wildfire through the private sector and then over into the public sector. Organization after organization would adopt scientific management as their guiding principle to make them effective and efficient. At the very heyday of scientific management, Mary Parker Follett was one of these lone voices in the wilderness, I guess you would call her, in that she was one of the only people who would stand up and take issue with these classical theorists. But she was doing it again when nobody was really listening. And unfortunately, I was with Mary Parker Follett. She was developing these theories and doing this writing as a female in the 1920s. And so she came up with a lot of the human relations theories before the human relations theorists did. But in the 1920s, she was standing up and taking issue with scientific management. She's one of my favorite theorists because, number one, she was a pioneer in the field, and she was willing to stand up and take issue to things that other people were buying into. And number two, I like her a lot because she kind of takes a more holistic view of our organizations. Mary Parker Follett argues to us that the most appropriate way for us to structure and run our organizations is to think of our organizations like democracies. And she likened running an organization to operating a democratic form of government. She really viewed our organizations from a democratic type of perspective. She says, if our organizations are democracies, then in order to make our organizations effective, we are going to have to deal with what she calls some of the fundamental flaws in a democratic system of government. And those fundamental flaws are things such as passive citizens and particularized interest. So she argues that democracies create passive citizens, and that in a true democracy, there are multiple avenues for people to participate in their own governance. You can vote, you can give money to candidates, you can work on campaigns, you can run for office yourself, all these different ways. You can have political discourse with your friends and family and coworkers. There are a lot of ways to participate in governance. But the way usually people participate in governance in a democracy is through voting. Voting is a relatively passive way to participate in self-governance. You decide who you're going to vote for, you then vote on election day, and that's pretty much the extent of your participation. So she says democracies really kind of channel people toward these passive ways of participating. It's kind of the same thing in organizations. Organizations have that same fundamental flaw in that they kind of channel people toward passivity rather than being active players in their own self-determination and self-governance. So the second problem with the democracy is the one that James Madison talked to us about and that you wrote about in Federalist number 10, and that is the existence of factions. Madison said, when you have a democracy, you're going to have factions. Factions are particularized interests. So you're going to have groups that have their own particularized things they're trying to achieve. And when you have all these different particularized interests, all these different factions, inevitably, you're going to end up with conflict. Madison in Federalist 10 said we can't eliminate factions because that's equivalent to eliminating democracy. So instead, we have to control their effects by balancing faction against faction, by trying to manage the conflict that occurs when these factions come into conflict with each other. Follett said organizations are the same way. We're going to have conflict in our organizations. We cannot get rid of conflict, but we need to learn how to manage and resolve that conflict. She argues that there are three main ways that you can resolve a conflict. One way is through domination. So you have two individuals, they each want different things. Well, through domination, one wins and one loses. And so one exerts power over the other, one exercises resource over the other, and gets their way. That's domination. She says domination is the least advisable way of dealing with conflict. We want to avoid domination if we can, because that party, that person, or that group that has lost, for lack of a better term, is obviously going to be disaffected, and they're not going to buy in to what the organization is doing. So she says domination is bad. The second way we can try and mitigate conflict and resolve conflict is through compromise. Well, compromise is better than domination, but there's still a problem with compromise. In compromise, if you have two individuals or two parties who are in conflict, through compromise, both parties will give something up. So they'll give something up to come to a compromise. because both parties are giving something up. They're never going to be fully satisfied. And so both parties will be somewhat disaffected. They won't be as disaffected as in domination, the party that loses, but there'll still be slight dissatisfaction with the compromise, and no one's really going to be very 100% happy with the compromise. So compromise is better than domination, but it's not the best. She argues the most appropriate way to deal with conflict is through what she calls integration, an integration of ideas. And this integration of ideas comes primarily through a process she refers to as interpenetration. That if we can get all these different groups and individuals together to talk about what they believe and to talk about their opinions and their perspectives, as they discuss this, as they have this discourse, some of the opinions of one person will then interpenetrate into someone else and vice versa. And it then creates an understanding that will allow us to come up with a new solution. And that new solution is what she calls integration. So instead of just compromising, and instead of one party dominating the other, everyone's going to work together to come up with this new way of looking at the problem that everyone can get on board with. And since everyone can get on board with it, you're going to have much more buy-in, and it'll be a much more effective organization. Now, Follett argues the only way you can have this is through participation. You need to reach out to all the employees in your organization. You need to make sure that they have the ability to self-govern and that they have the ability to build their own power resources so that they can be capable of engaging in this integration process. So she sees a much more vital and important role for employees in the governance of the organization as compared to Weber, Taylor, and Gulick and the classical school of organization theory. Now, obviously, the disadvantage or the criticism of Mary Parker Follett is that it is a very idealistic approach. You know, Follett is telling us we can all get together, we can participate, we can share ideas. It is very idealistic. It may not be possible in especially large organizations to achieve this level of interpenetration and integration. But the importance of Mary Parker Follett is she at least theoretically moves us off of classic organization theory and starts talking about the importance of being concerned about employees and being concerned about their ability to participate in the decision-making processes going on within the organization. So she's kind of, a lot of authors refer to her as a pre-human relations theorist, because chronologically she kind of fits in there between classical and human relations theory. Another author who is squarely within the school of human relations theory is someone known as Chester Barnard. And Chester Barnard was best known for his work, The Functions of the Executive. Barnard argues to us that for managers and leaders to be effective, they need to get the compliance on the part of their employees. That it's not good enough for a leader or manager just to say, do this and expect for it to get done. In order for it to get done and to contribute to the effectiveness of the organization, that leader or manager needs to get the buy-in on the part of their employees. They need to get the compliance from their employees. Barnard viewed organizations as being a transactional type of world, where they are predicated upon transactions between managers and subordinates. So managers need subordinates to provide contributions to the organization to get the job done. Contributions could be putting forth effort, maybe working extra time, putting extra thought and effort into whatever job they're doing. Those are the contributions. And so by putting that extra effort in, and by putting forth that extra time to work on a project, they're contributing their skills and their time to the organization. But Barnard realized that you weren't just going to get these contributions just by asking for them. That to get those contributions and get that compliance, you needed to provide incentives to those employees. So you provide them incentives that they value, and those employees will then respond by providing those contributions to the organization. So if you want someone to come in and work overtime on a weekend to get a project done, to give you that contribution, you have to incentivize it. So you incentivize it by perhaps, if they do this and get the project done, they're going to be employee of the week. Or maybe they'll get to move to an office that they've always prized, or something like that. It's something that they value. Why that is important is because it's no longer a top-down, one-way type of relationship. It is now a two-way relationship, albeit a very transactional one. So you provide incentives that your employees value, and if they value the incentives enough, they're going to give you the contributions. They're going to put forth the effort. What that means for leaders and managers is that they need to know their employees. They need to know and recognize what their employees place a value upon. If you tell someone, well, if you do this, you're going to be employee of the week next week, and the person doesn't care one bit about being employee of the week, they don't value that incentive. When we talk about valuing incentives, the value someone places on an incentive in the literature is known as the valence level. And I put that in text, valence level. Every employee is going to have a different valence level for different types of incentives. So as a leader or manager, you need to know the valence levels of your employees for all these different types of incentives, and then dole out the appropriate incentives based upon those valence levels. You need to know your employees. Barnard also adds to that whole idea of you need to know your employees with his theory known as zones of indifference. So Barnard says also every employee is going to have what he calls a different zone of indifference. Your zone of indifference is where if you are asked to do something that does not violate your value system or doesn't impose too much of a burden on you, you're probably going to do it. However, if a manager asks you to do something that violates your value system, violates your ethical principles, you're going to push back on that, and you're probably not going to do it. Barnard says that's what we call the zone of indifference. So you need to know what your employees value and then not violate those values or not ask those employees to violate their values. You need to operate within this zone of indifference. And if you operate within the zone of indifference and you don't violate their values, then you're more likely to get contributions from your employees. But you can see how stark of a shift this is from classic organization theory. Now we're talking about communicating with our employees, as Paula said, allowing them to participate, as Barnard says, knowing what they value and providing them the right set of incentives. You need to know your employees as individual human beings. And that's really what sets the human relations school apart from the classical school and those three classical theorists we talked about previously. Then another human relations theorist, and again, we're not talking about them all, just kind of highlighting them for you, that you've probably run into before, especially if you've done work in psychology, is Elton Mayo. Elton Mayo is best known for his Hawthorne experiments. He did a whole series of experiments. One of his best known experiments is the Hawthorne experiment. Anybody familiar with the Hawthorne experiment and how the Hawthorne experiment worked? Go ahead. Anybody on the Hawthorne experiment?
Yeah.
And again, this is something that most folks, especially if you've been in the world of psychology, you're probably very familiar with. Anybody on Hawthorne experiment? Essentially, it was a human type of study that Mayo decided, well, let's see the impact that a change in a physical stimulant will have on the productivity of employees. So what he did is he went to the Hawthorne electrical plant. He said, at this Hawthorne electrical plant, let's develop, as a good scientist, we'll develop some hypotheses. So his first hypothesis was, if we increase the lighting level, if we turn the lights up, people can see what they're doing better and they will become more productive. So there'll be a strong positive relationship between increased lighting levels and worker productivity. So they turned the lights up. Sure enough, people became more productive. So you could check off that hypothesis confirmed. Then he said, let's do the inverse. So the second hypothesis was, if we turn the lighting level down, people won't be able to see what they're doing and they'll be less productive. So he and his colleagues turned down the lighting level, and you can guess what happened. People actually became more productive again, and productivity even went higher than when he turned up the lighting. So he found it wasn't the lighting level that was inducing productivity. What was inducing productivity is that people were being watched. People, they had their performance being evaluated by Hawthorne and by Mayo and his colleagues, and they were being listened to. So Mayo and his colleagues, they would do debriefing sessions with these employees, and they would ask them about all different aspects of their job and the tasks they do on a daily basis. And in doing so, they were paying attention to employees. They were treating employees as valuable human beings. And what Mayo found out is that's the social aspect of an organization. That there's a social aspect of organizations that oftentimes are just as important as the formal aspects of those organizations, just as important as the structure and the process of work and the principles and all these other good things, just as important as all those things is recognizing that people are human beings and they are social creatures. The second important thing that came out of the Hawthorne experiment was the recognition of the importance of informal groups. So what Mayo and his colleagues would do is they would set up groups of employees and they would monitor the performance of those groups. What they would find is that in these groups, if one person was not pulling their weight, one person was not working hard enough and was reducing the productivity of the entire group, then the rest of the group would then push this person to work harder and say, you're making us look bad, so you need to really get to work, and would force that one person in the group to increase their productivity level. So groups and group pressure is another thing that Mayo and his colleagues recognized through these Hawthorne experiments. But taken as a whole, the big contribution of Mayo to human relations theory is, again, the idea of people as human beings and the importance of recognizing their social needs, their needs to interact with each other, and their needs to be valued by others. And it's important to recognize those needs in order to make the organization as effective as possible. So you can kind of see, certainly, hopefully you can see clearly, how the human relations school has really built off of some of the flaws in the classical school to really bring our attention squarely upon the individual human beings within our organization. But we don't stop there with the human relations school. We had other schools that developed after that, and those other schools that developed after that, oftentimes, as we said before, developed because of a perceived flaw in the school that preceded them. And so the perceived flaw in the human relations school was, yes, we are focusing more on human beings and the human element, the social element in our organization, but we're doing it to benefit the organization. At the end of the day, the ultimate goal is to make the organization more effective, to pay attention to people so we can extract contributions from them, higher productivity levels, to then make the organization more productive and more effective. So we are kind of exploiting these individuals and exploiting their human needs in order to make the organization more effective. So when all is said and done, we're still focusing on the organization's needs rather than the needs of individual employees. So because of that criticism of the human relations school, in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s, we start to see the development of this next school of thought known as the human resource management school. Now, when some people teach the chronological development of public organization theory, they will combine human relations and human resource management theorists together. I don't. I separate them into two separate schools of thought because there is a profound difference between human relations and human resource management theory. Again, human relations theory at the end of the day was focused on making the organization effective and helping the organization achieve organizational goals. In the human resource management school, it's not only about the organization's goals, but it's about helping the individual employee achieve their own individual goals as well. And so the goals of the individual employee become just as important as the goals of the organization. And to use an old saying from President John Kennedy, he said, "Ask not what you can do for your country. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." It's the same type of thing here. Ask not what you can do for the organization, but ask what can the organization do for you. So it now becomes a two-way street. For organizations, it becomes incumbent upon them to try and help their individual employees develop as human resources. Hence the reason why the school of thought is called human resource management theory. The three main authors that we talk about here in human resource management theory are Abraham Maslow, Douglas McGregor, and Chris Argyris. Now, Abraham Maslow, you probably again run into him in your undergraduate studies. He is best known for his pyramidal approach to the psychological and the physiological needs of human beings. As you can see in the triangle there on your screen, that pyramid, basically what Maslow says is that every human being has different types of needs, and these needs all fit into different levels in this pyramid. At the bottom level of the pyramid are what he calls the physiological needs. So needs for things like shelter and clothing and food and water. Those are physiological needs. According to Maslow, people will be motivated to achieve those needs until those needs are achieved. Then what he calls deficiency needs. So you're motivated by a deficiency in one of those physiological needs. Once that deficiency is remedied, it then goes away as a motivator, and you're no longer motivated by it once you've achieved it. Then the next higher level, again, another deficiency type of need, is what he calls safety needs. And so the need to feel safe from harm. Once you feel safe from harm, then it no longer motivates you because you've remedied that deficiency. Then next level up, he has belongingness needs, the need to feel that you belong to a group or belong to society. That type of psychological need is, again, a deficiency type of need because once you feel that you belong, it no longer will motivate you to try and achieve that belongingness. Next level up are esteem needs, the need to feel that you're held in high esteem by colleagues and family and friends, a very psychological type of orientation. Then at the very apex of this hierarchy of needs, you have what he calls self-actualization. And you can think about self-actualization as kind of being all that you can be, achieving your full sense of self, achieving what you want to be as a human being. Self-actualization needs are separate from the bottom four levels because now with self-actualization needs, this is what we call the growth needs. On this chart, it's called the being needs, but they're the growth needs. This is something that goes on and on, that you're never going to fully satisfy your need for self-actualization. You're always going to be spurred on to grow and to become better as a person and more fulfilled as a person. So with self-actualization, that growth need, you're always going to be motivated by self-actualization, even if you have fulfilled all the other deficiency needs below it. Well, so what? My favorite question, so what? Well, the so what here is that it again highlights the need to know your employees and then take proactive steps to help your employees engage in this growth process, engage in this process of self-actualization. So it's not just the goal of the organization, but now it's the goal of helping your individual employees self-actualize. Douglas McGregor was a big student of Abraham Maslow, really bought into Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs theory. McGregor took this hierarchy of needs theory and applied it to our organizations. The argument that McGregor made is that there are two different types of employees. There are what he calls Theory X employees versus Theory Y employees. For McGregor, a Theory X employee is kind of the vision of an employee under the classical organizational school. So people are lazy, people are not very intelligent, people are not creative, people don't seek out responsibility or accountability. They're kind of like what the classical authors thought they were. And those are what he calls Theory X employees. However, on the other side, you have the complete opposite, and that's a theory Y employee. And a theory Y employee is just the opposite of a theory X. So a theory Y employee is motivated, they like to work, they are creative, they're innovative, they're intelligent, they seek out accountability and responsibility in their positions. They aspire to what we call these superordinate positions. They aspire to leadership and management positions. Those are theory Y employees. Okay, well, so what? The so what here is the problem is a mismatch between organizations and employees. McGregor argues that most of our employees are theory Y employees. Now, not all. He admits that there are some clunkers in every organization. But for the most part, the majority of our employees are theory Y types of employees. However, they're working in theory X organizations. So a theory X classical type of organization is not going to allow a theory Y employee to ever self-actualize, to ever have the ability to grow and self-actualize. So what McGregor argues is that we need to take our theory X organizations and transform them into theory Y organizations to help our theory Y employees grow. Now, a lot of the specifics on how that happens come to us from McGregor's student, Chris Argyris. And so Argyris, who is a student of Douglas McGregor, took McGregor's theory X and theory Y approach and started trying to develop substantive ways in which our organizations can help our employees develop as theory Y employees. Argyris viewed people going through a maturation process. He says people age, they go through this process of maturation, what he calls a personal growth arc. So as you age, you go through a personal growth arc. Through this personal growth arc, you develop what he calls deepening interest, that you're interested in more things and a wider variety of things than you were when you were younger. You develop a much longer term perspective in that you're concerned 10, 20, 30 years down the road as opposed to a couple weeks down the road. You become very vested and rooted in your community. And you start taking on roles of leadership in your community, and you start caring about benefiting your community rather than your salary or your individual position. People want to become leaders and managers. They want to be in superordinate positions. They're not satisfied just staying in subordinate positions. So what Argyris argues is that people have this natural personal growth arc that they go through as human beings, but theory X organizations don't let them go through this personal growth period or this personal growth development. So what Argyris says is organizations can do some specific things. One thing organizations can do that he talks about is a process known as job enrichment. And he's got a whole series of things that he recommends for organizations to become more theory Y and less theory X in orientation. But one is job enrichment. So he'll argue that organizations need to allow individual employees to participate in the development of their jobs, to allow them to participate in deciding what types of tasks they're going to do on a daily basis, what types of skills they need to develop, what types of training and development opportunities they need. Individual employees need to have that type of self-governance and self-determination. So you're allowing them through their revised job description to try out new skills and try and learn new tasks and skills and try and develop so that they can grow as an individual. And you allow them to have that type of input in terms of what they're doing on a daily basis. Because again, it's not just what the individual is doing for the organization, but it's what the organization is doing to benefit the individual. You get to a situation in human resource management theory where you allow people to self-actualize and develop skills and develop themselves as human resources, even if it means that they will eventually leave the organization. If they develop as human resources and then take their skills elsewhere, under human resource management theory, that's okay, because your goal is developing them as human resources, not just what they can give back to the organization. So you can see with human resource management theory how far afield we have come from Weber, Taylor, and Gulick, and the classical types of theorists. Now we're really valuing individuals, and we're allowing them and helping them to develop as human beings. A very big departure from where we were with Max Weber and Frederick Taylor. In the 1960s and 1970s, we see the development of this thing known as systems school of thought and the development of systems theory. One of the deficiencies that some folks saw in the human resource management approach is that it always looked internal to the organization, without a recognition of how the organization interfaces and interacts with its external environment. So that then led to the development of systems theory. The idea that organizations are part of something bigger, that organizations are part of a bigger ecology, a bigger system, and we really need to understand how the system affects the organization, and in turn, how the organization can affect the system. There are two different approaches to systems theory that we saw develop. One approach is what's known as closed systems theory, sometimes referred to as natural systems theory. In closed or natural systems theory, we look at organizations as being living organisms. So we say, as a living organism, the primary goal of an organization is survival. That organization, everything that organization does is going to be geared toward helping that organization survive into the future. And so organizations that survive in the future are those organizations that have a well-regulated system of internal processes. So you think about an organization like the human body. People are probably going to live longer, barring any type of accident or unforeseen calamity, if they are healthy, if they have normal blood pressure, if they, their pulse ox rate is normal, if they're devoid of diseases, if they have a normal BMI, whatever the indicators are from a health perspective, that those people with those good indicators are probably going to live longer than people with poor indicators. And so that's organizational health. And so you want your organizations to find that point of organizational health so that they can survive into the future. The problem, I don't want to depress you too much tonight on a Tuesday evening, but the problem is that when you look at organizations as living organisms from the time that they are born will go through what we call an entropy process. And that entropy process is a process whereby living organisms will dissipate energy into their environment. So as you age, you kind of lose energy and you lose energy into your environment until at some point in time, there's not enough energy left in that organization to survive in the future. And that organization then goes out of existence. Closed natural systems theorists view this entropy process as something that is inevitable, that all organizations go through, and once they get to the end of that entropy process, they no longer have the energy, the resources they need to survive into the future. The second approach to systems theory then, and a happier approach, I guess we'd say, is what we call open systems theory. In open systems theory, we are looking at the relationship between the organization and its environment, but not just it dissipating energy into the environment, but we're looking at how the organization can pull new energy and pull new resources back in to the organization. So instead of just this one-way entropy process like we saw with closed or natural systems theory, in open systems theory, we now have a dynamic two-way process known as negative entropy. So yes, organizations can dissipate resources and dissipate energy out into their environment, but at the same time, they're importing new energy and importing new resources into the organization to replace those resources that they lost. And hopefully the energy and resources that are being imported are more valuable than the ones that are being exported. And that's how these organizations then survive throughout time. So when you think about resources and energy that can be imported into the organization, you're talking about things such as a skilled and available labor pool. You're talking about money. You're talking about political support. Those are all energies that organizations can bring with them into the organization to survive. So when you measure the effectiveness of the organization, that's another way to measure its effectiveness, how skillful it has been and how successful it's been at bringing those new energies back into the organization through this process known as negative entropy. I think systems theory adds a very important dimension to our understanding of organizations. Now with systems theory, we're looking at the organization as part of the whole, the organization as part of this much bigger system, this much bigger framework. And I think it's true that public organizations are never insulated unto themselves. Public organizations are floating around in this external environment, and we need to really understand the external environment and how the organization and environment interact to better understand why organizations look the way in which they look and why organizations do the types of things that they do. So I think systems theory really gives us that added additional perspective. And there are a lot of modern theories, and we're not going to get into all the modern theories. By modern, we're talking post-1970. There's quality management, there's leadership theories, there are all kinds of newer theories. The one modern theory that I do want to highlight for you tonight in our limited time together is a theory of organization culture. And I like organization culture a lot because I think it's very appropriate, and I think it's true for most of our organizations. Organization culture argues that if we want to study organizations in public administration, we need to recognize that every organization has its own different, unique culture. So the basic question is, what is a culture? Culture is basically a set of norms, values, expectations, basically expectations for behavior, the way in which we're going to interact with each other, what we place a value upon. Those are kind of indicators of a culture. And the argument here goes that every organization has its own norms and values and expectations for behavior. Every organization has its own organization culture. So if we assume every organization has its own unique organizational culture, we then have to learn how to study those unique organizational cultures. But there are different ways in which you can study them. One very basic way we can study organization culture is by studying what are called organizational artifacts. And so very similar to if you were going on an archaeological dig. You go on an archaeological dig to try and learn about an ancient society. You're going to dig up artifacts such as maybe eating utensils, artifacts such as maybe pieces of artwork, tangible things that we can actually touch and tangible things we can actually analyze that will give us insight into the daily operations and the daily process of living in that culture back in ancient times. Well, just like you can dig up eating utensils as artifacts of an ancient society, you can dig up manifestations of artifacts in organizations as well. So some of the artifacts that organizations will create are things such as minutes from meetings, meeting agendas, strategic plans. Those are tangible things that we can analyze in order to understand how daily life looks in that organization, what that organization values, and what that organization expects of its members. Then a second, more hidden level from artifacts is what's called espoused values. The espoused values of the organization will be things such as its vision statement and its mission statement. And I assume most of your organizations, if not all, will have a mission and a vision statement. Those are espoused values. Those are where the organization is telling you this is who we are and this is what we value. So those are relatively easy to see, maybe not as easy to collect as artifacts, but still relatively easy to collect and analyze. At the third level of culture, and the more hidden level, is what we call our basic assumptions. And this is where it becomes difficult in studying an organization's culture. With basic assumptions, these are the type of unspoken things that we value. So in an organization, we may all value politeness, or we may all value collegiality, but we really don't speak of those things. We just all kind of share that as an assumed value, but we don't really talk about it very much. Since we don't talk about it, we don't write it down in written documentation, it's much more difficult for us to study those basic assumptions as part of an organization's culture. give you an example from a few years ago here at Long Beach. We had a situation in the college with a faculty member who was notorious for not treating other people very well and not being a very good colleague. And so the former dean, not this current dean, but like 3 deans ago, quite a ways in the past, decided that he wanted to discipline this faculty member. Well, this was a full professor with tenure, and the dean found out that there was nothing written about collegiality as an expectation of faculty members. It wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't part of our artifacts. It wasn't part of our espoused values. We all assumed that that's how we would all behave and interact with each other, but we had never really written that down. And so I actually came up with a collegiality policy, believe it or not, for faculty. In my school district, we had to do the same thing. And we had to come up with a civility code that we had to actually articulate how parents would act when they were on campus, how parents and teachers would interact with each other, how students would interact with each other. And we actually had to write that down. And just because, even though it was a basic assumption, it was something that wasn't necessarily shared by everyone. And so we had to make that into a espoused value. Culture doesn't just happen by accident. Culture is oftentimes embedded by leaders. So new leaders come into an organization and they will embed their culture into that organization. So some ways that leaders embed culture into the organization can be through things like slogans. So, together we can achieve more, which was the slogan the superintendent brought into my school district when I was on the board. That's a way in which you can embed culture. You can embed culture by showing what you care about as a leader. So the types of things that you reward, the types of things that you pay attention to, the types of things that you may discipline and punish. Those types of behaviors then, and the way in which you respond to those behaviors can signal culture. So if an employee sees another employee being rewarded for acting in a certain type of way, well, that's something this organization values. That's an important part of this organization's culture. Or someone being disciplined for acting the way in which they're not supposed to act, that's, again, a good indicator of that organization's culture. Probably one of the major reasons why I like organization culture so much as a school of thought is because it really does feed into my favorite answer to everything, which is it depends. Because understanding an organization will depend upon the unique culture within that organization. Now, certainly there are aspects of culture shared by different organizations, but I would argue that every organization does have its unique organization culture, and we need to recognize and understand that culture before we can really understand why the organization acts and behaves in the way in which it does. So again, this was a really quick coverage of the theories in public administration as they relate to organizations, because again, the study of public administration is the study of public organizations. Again, the moral and the takeaway from this discussion of about 150 years of literature, at least the highlights of that literature, is that the search for the one-size-fits-all approach is over. Classical theorists tried to tell us they could develop the one-size-fits-all, the one best approach, whether it be structure or work process or skills for managers and principles for managers. What we have learned is there is no one-size-fits-all approach. That when we study public administration, it's a very dynamic and contextual approach that we need to take. We need to study public administration based upon the situation in which we are dealing. We have to know the time that we're dealing. We have to know the organization we're dealing with. We need to know the policies and programs we're dealing with. We need to know the actors who are involved in implementing those programs and those policies. So our approach to studying public administration today is a very contextual approach. The upshot of that is that whenever you have a contextual approach to studying a phenomenon, what happens is it becomes very complicated. And it becomes much more difficult than if you can just develop one simple theory and apply it to the entire field. So the study of public administration today is admittedly much more complex and much more complicated than it has ever been in the past. We're no longer looking for the one-size-fits-all approach. We're now looking for the approach that works most appropriately in this given situation. Getting all the way back to our first night of class when I cautioned you guys, we're never looking for the best approach, but rather we are looking for the most appropriate approach. I think the development of public administration literature has really been the development of trying to find the most appropriate approaches as opposed to a singular best type of an approach. So I think going through this chronological development of organization theory really does underscore the fact that we probably are a discipline. We probably are an academic discipline. Now, we are an academic discipline somewhat unlike other academic disciplines in that we oftentimes borrow theories from other disciplines to then apply to our study of public organizations. So I see we're at 5:20, so we really need to take a break. We've been at this for a while, but let's take about a 10-minute break. And when we come back at 5:30, I kind of want to work ahead a little bit. And this kind of, our discussion theories kind of wraps up, what we have on the agenda for now. But I kind of like to work ahead into a discussion of how we apply these theories in the formulation, implementation, evaluation of public policy. So take about 10 minutes, come back at 5:30, and we'll do a little foreshadowing for a little bit on public policy, just to kind of get ourselves ahead of the game, because this is week number 5, and we only have 7 sessions together. So we only have 2 more sessions together after tonight. So I want to make sure if we can work ahead on policy a little bit tonight, then we'll be able to clear the decks to make sure that we can get through all of our information over the next 2 weeks. So take a break, and we will come on back at 5:30 and talk a little bit about public policy. All right, it's 5:30, so welcome back. And what I'd like to do in the second half of class is, like I said, work ahead a little bit and get into public policy. So let's tie this together. So before the break, we talked about the theories approaching the ways in which we study public organizations. And we went through the chronological development of all these different schools of thought of how we study public organizations. Now, beginning with the second half of class tonight and going through the remainder of our semester together, we are going to turn our attention to what public organizations do. And when we look at what public organizations do, we're going to look at public policy, how they formulate and implement public policy. We're going to look at how they evaluate public programs. We're going to look at how they manage their resources, how they manage human resources, how they manage fiscal resources, how they manage performance and performance expectations. So we're really going to get into the kind of the what of public organizations do, and kind of what we do in public administration as public administrators. So that will kind of be our direction starting now through the end of the course. So let's start talking about public policy as something that organizations do. We know that administrators, as we talked about last week, are very much involved in the formulation of public policy, but they're also really involved in the implementation and even the evaluation of that policy as well. So let's talk a bit about how they do all those different policy-related functions. Now, what complicates some folks' understanding of our program and our department from the outside is they'll see we're an MPA program, a master's degree of public administration, master's of public administration degree. But the MPA, Master's of Public Administration degree, is provided within a department known as the Graduate Center for Public Policy and Administration. And we're called a center. We're really an academic department. Why we're called a center dates way back decades ago to we used to be a college and then ended up needing to transition from a college to a department. And the faculty at the time liked the sound of center better, and so that's why we're called the center. We're basically an academic department, but we are a graduate center for public policy and administration. So a lot of prospective applicants, I'll get emails when I was chair from prospective applicants talking about a master's of public policy degree. We're not a master's of public policy degree, we're a master of public administration degree. But as public administrators, we are intimately involved in public policy as well. So when we define public policy is a little bit different than public programs. So this week, we're going to talk about public policies. Next week, we're going to talk about public program evaluation. When you're thinking about the difference between a public policy and a public program, think about it kind of like in an umbrella. So the public policy is the umbrella. It's the overarching umbrella of what we are trying to achieve in a specific type of policy area. So we may have something like, the education of at-risk youth, and that's our public policy. So our goal of our public policy is to try and educate as many at-risk youth as possible. And that's the goal of our overarching public policy. How we achieve that goal of educating at-risk youth will be done through the specific public programs that all help support that overarching policy. So the overarching policy of educating at-risk youth, and then we could have specific programs that help achieve that goal, such as we might have a after-school counseling program. That after-school counseling program should help us achieve our goal, our policy goal of educating at-risk youth. We may have another public program, such as maybe we'll say a job training program. That job training program will then help us educate at-risk youth. Maybe we'll have another program oriented toward computer literacy that will help us then educate at-risk youth. Perhaps there'll be a child care program that will help us educate at-risk youth. So look at the policy as the overarching umbrella, and then the programs are those specific types of things that we are doing on a daily basis to help us achieve those overall policy goals and policy aims. So try and keep that distinction between public policies and public programs a little separate, because there are different strategies that we use when we engage in policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation, as compared to when we engage in the evaluation of public programs. So tonight we're going to talk about the overarching umbrella of public policy. So when we look at public policy and the policy-making process, there are several different stages that we go through in policy making. That first phase that we've already talked about frequently through the first part of the semester is the phase of policy formulation, sometimes called policy formation. I like to say formulation. I think the author, Don Kettle, likes to call it policy formation. Same thing, same term, just used interchangeably. So policy formulation is our first phase of the policy-making process. Obviously, this is where we are crafting our policies, putting our policies and laws together. John Kingdon is a very famous scholar who talked a lot and wrote a lot about the policy formulation process, and specifically wrote a lot about what he called agenda setting. Now, we've already talked about agenda setting earlier in the semester when we talked about power. And I introduced you to John Gaventa and his 3 different faces of power, and said, hold on to that information because we'll cover it throughout the remainder of the class. That second face or type of power that Gaventa talks about is this idea of mobilization of bias. And we define mobilization of bias as essentially agenda setting, keeping issues off of the agenda. So before we can make a policy or pass a law affecting any type of activity or affecting any type of issue, that issue must first make it onto the formal agenda of a decision-making body. So John Kingdon talked and wrote a lot about how issues make it onto formal decision-making agendas. And Kingdon kind of likened it to a primordial soup. And so you've got this primordial soup out there of all these different types of issues that are kind of floating around. How an issue then crawls out of that primordial soup and makes it onto the official agenda of a decision-making body, usually what happens is you have some type of a triggering event. You have some type of a focusing event that will galvanize public opinion around the idea that this is something that needs a policy, that we need a policy to address this issue. Just in common vernacular all the time, people, when they see something that they don't like, they say, there ought to be a law. There ought to be a law about that. Well, when they say there ought to be a law, what they're saying is we should make a policy to address this issue. So issues must first get onto the formal agenda of a decision-making body, and that's the agenda setting process. Issues can get onto the formal decision-making agenda in a variety of different ways. There are a variety of different decision-making models that we can engage in deciding which issues make it onto the agenda and then how the resulting policy should be formulated to address those issues. So tonight what I'd like to do is introduce you to 4 different decision-making models that we typically see used in the policy formulation process. Some of these models you have encountered before. Some of these models may be new to you. The first model I think you've probably encountered before. And this first model is what's called the rational comprehensive model. Now, we make decisions rationally. When we say we're going to be rational about something, it means that we're going to consider all options. We're going to take a lot of information into account and use that information, analyze that information in making our decision. We're not going to just make the decision, the jerk of a knee, and just make a decision just out of the blue. We're going to collect all this information and utilize it to make decisions. That's rational comprehensive decision making. So in rational comprehensive decision making, it's a very linear type of decision making process. Our first step is to clearly define our policy goals. So what are we trying to achieve with this policy? With welfare policy reform, our primary goal was to find a way to transition people from welfare to work. That was the primary goal that we were trying to achieve. So we clearly identify that goal and hopefully gain agreement among our stakeholders on what that goal is. We then go out there and collect all the available information, all the information that is out there. We go out there and collect all that information, and we use it to then identify means or alternatives for achieving our goals. So the strategies for achieving our goals. We put together a full range of those alternatives, a full range of means or strategies for achieving our goal. And the important thing here in rational comprehensive is because we have collected all the available information, we are able to then say with confidence, we have put together the full range, all the possible alternatives. If we have put together all the possible alternatives, we are then able in step number 5 to select the singular best alternative and then implement that best alternative as our policy solution. That's rational comprehensive decision making. Clearly, the advantage of rational comprehensive decision making is it's very holistic, it's very comprehensive, as it says in the title. We're taking into account all of our information, and we're relatively confident that we are then selecting the best alternative as our public policy. The criticisms are obvious. We're human beings. As human beings, we have cognitive limitations. Herbert Simon referred to our cognitive limitations as having bounded rationality. We have limitations, parameters placed upon just how rational we can be as human beings. Not only do we have this bounded rationality and these cognitive limitations, which will preclude us from putting together a full range of alternatives, we also have the presence of what we call externalities. And externalities are unintended consequences. So there may be some unintended consequences from a certain course of action that we are not able to predict. We don't know will happen. And so therefore, there could be some negative aspects of some of the alternatives, and we were not able to consider those negative aspects. So basically, the moral of the story here again is that while rational comprehensive decision-making makes sense in a classroom setting, it's very difficult to obviously implement it in the everyday world of public policy and administration. The approach that we usually do implement in public administration is our second decision-making model of incrementalism. And again, I'm sure you've run into incrementalism before. If you do any work with public budgets, then you are keenly aware of incrementalism, because incrementalism is how we make our decisions in our public budgets. In incrementalism, it's a much more limited type of decision-making model as compared to rational comprehensive. That first step, we're not able to easily define our goals. Our goals may be ambiguous. They may be very vague. We may not be able to get agreement of most of our stakeholders on what the real goal of this policy is. Not only do we have unclear goals, but we have the inability to collect as much information as we were collecting under rational comprehensive. We cannot collect all of the information. We'll collect as much information as our limited resources will allow. Since we're only collecting limited information, we cannot put together a full range of alternative solutions or strategies. Instead, we will put together a limited range of alternatives. We will then do what we call limited successive comparisons. We'll compare alternative A to alternative B, alternative B to alternative C, alternative C to alternative D, then we'll go back and do A to D and B to D and so on and so on. We're making these very limited successive comparisons, which means that we are not going to be able to say with any amount of confidence that we are selecting the quote unquote best alternative. We can say we selected the first appropriate alternative that works for us, but we can't say that it is the best alternative. The best alternative may be floating around out there in the ether and we've never really even thought about it, let alone considered it. And then we implement what we consider to be the most appropriate alternative, and that then becomes the basis for our public policy. The advantages of incrementalism is that obviously it's much more realistic. It's a way of making decisions within the parameters of our bounded rationality, dealing with our cognitive limitations. The criticism, though, is that we're not going to really have a lot of big change if we do policy making through incrementalism. We're probably just going to end up repeating what we did last year, next year, and the year after that, the year after that. So we may avoid big mistakes, but we're going to continue to make small mistakes year after year after year. Now, Charles Lindblom is obviously the author who is most known for this distinction between rational comprehensive and incrementalism. He wrote an article many years ago where he essentially described incrementalism as the dominant decision-making model, both in our organizations as well as in our policy process. He got a lot of accolades for his article, said he didn't deserve those accolades because he wasn't developing any new theory. All he was doing is describing what actually happens within our organizations and in the policy process. Now, I would encourage you to look at this difference between rational comprehensive, or as Lindblom calls it, the root approach, and incrementalism, or as Lindblom calls it, the branch approach, kind of as a continuum rather than as a dichotomy. We can see glimmers of rationality in our policymaking. We can sometimes be more rational than at other times. We're never going to be purely rational. And absent budgeting, we're oftentimes not going to be purely incremental. We're going to be somewhere in between the two extremes. There's an approach to policy making that's known as punctuated equilibrium. And the punctuated equilibrium theory says that for the most part, we're incremental. And for the most part, we have this equilibrium in the way in which we make policy. But every now and then, we become more rational. So there's a triggering event, or there's some type of a window of opportunity that allows us to introduce more rationality into our policymaking process. So something known as punctuated equilibrium. Our third decision-making model combines our first two together. So it combines rational comprehensive together with incrementalism. And that's a model known as mixed scanning. It comes to us from a theorist by the name of Amitai Etzioni. Etzione's mixed scanning combines rationality and incrementalism and makes the argument that we will try and be more rational for our bigger, more momentous issues while being incremental and saving time and money for our smaller, more mundane issues. So if we are purchasing staples for our office next month, we can be incremental, because that's a very small issue. That's an issue where we can answer the question by looking at how many staples we used in the previous month. So that lends itself to incrementalism. However, if we're constructing a new building for $100 million, we're probably going to want to be more rational and take more information into account. I always like to look at the budgeting process as a great example of mixed scanning decision making. So our operating budgets that we use for our day-to-day functions in our organization, those operating budgets are typically done through incremental decision making. We look at how much money we spent last year. We then add on maybe 2 or 3 or 4% for next year to make up for inflationary factors and make up for increases in the cost of doing business. But our operating budget will be very incremental. However, if we're going to build that new building, that $100 million building, that's going to be a part of our capital budgeting process, separate from our operating budgeting process. We segregate those high price tag, long lifespan types of projects into a separate capital budgeting process so that we can be more rational in that type of decision making. So we can take our time and collect all the possible information before deciding what course of action we want to fund with that $100 million. So capital budgeting tends to be much more rational in nature. Operating budgeting tends to be much more incremental in nature. The advantage of mixed scanning, obviously, is it makes great sense to us. Big issues were more rational. Smaller policies were more incremental. The problem with it, obviously, is it's subjective. It's not always obvious to us what is a big versus what is a small issue. What may be a big issue for one person may appear to be a small issue for another person. What is a big issue today may, in hindsight, really look like a very small issue a few years from now. So there is some subjectivity involved with mixed scanning. Then there's our fourth decision-making model, and I think this decision-making model explains a lot of our policy-making process. And that's a model called garbage can model of decision-making from Cohen, March, and Olson. Now, I love the model, but I hate the title. I hate the title garbage can model, because garbage can model just kind of sounds like chaos. You just throw everything in a garbage can, and what you get is what you get. It's not like that. Garbage can model decision-making really does have some rhyme and reason to it. There are steps that we follow in garbage can model of decision-making. In garbage can model of decision-making, we make policy decisions. We make public policies at the confluence of 4 different streams. So when these 4 streams listed on the screen all come together and they converge at that confluence of those streams, that's where we tend to make our policy decisions. And the 4 streams are participant, problem, solution, and choice opportunity or triggering event stream. So let's talk about those 4 streams and how they can come together. The first stream is the participant stream. This simply means that we need to have decision makers, policy makers in those policy making positions who are predisposed to making a policy about an issue or making a big change to our policy orientation on an issue. So we have to have people, decision makers there in the right offices who are predisposed to making a decision, for a decision to be made. So you got to have your participants in place. But the second stream is the problem stream. This is kind of similar to what I mentioned before, the John Kingdom primordial soup of issues. So we've got this stream of problems that are floating around out there, all these different types of problems. We as a society, we are somewhat aware of these problems, but we really haven't fleshed them out all that well. But there are a whole bunch of problems out there that can be addressed in public policy. Then third, we have our solution stream. Our solution stream is going to be a stream of all these solutions, new or old, that are floating around out there that we can choose from to apply to a problem to try and solve that problem. And then our fourth stream, this choice opportunity triggering event stream, something happens that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change in our policy. We need to develop a new policy, or we need to substantially change our current policy direction in order to address this issue or this problem. So here's an example of garbage can model decision making. So several years ago, there was this value jet crash. So there's a budget airline called Value Jet. Unfortunately, one of its planes crashed in the Florida Everglades, killing everyone on board, killing 110, I think almost everyone on board, 110 people. In this value jet crash, we ended up getting a major policy change as a result. The participant stream. We had consumer rights groups and we had members of Congress who were predisposed to addressing this issue that we'll talk about in a second in airline safety. And there was a problem that was very clearly illustrated. The problem in airline safety was the absence of any way to detect a fire in the cargo bay of a plane. We didn't really have any detection mechanisms in cargo bays of plane required back in the 1990s. We had a solution stream, and then we had a whole bunch of solutions out there that could help us identify when a fire occurred in the cargo bay of a plane. One of those solutions was the presence of smoke detectors. Now, obviously, we didn't invent smoke detectors in this policy example in the 1990s. They predated this policy example, but they were a solution that was out there that we could take that solution and apply it to this problem of the inability to detect a fire in the cargo bay of a plane. However, we didn't really get a policy requiring smoke detectors in the cargo bay of the plane until the triggering event occurred. And the triggering event was the crash of ValueJet 582 in the Florida Everglades, killing 110 people. That trigger event then galvanized public opinion about there ought to be a law. There ought to be a policy on this. And then all four of your streams all converge together, and we end up getting a policy that requires the presence of smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. That's, I think, a pretty good illustration of this idea of garbage can model of decision making. The participants came together with an identified problem, a solution that actually existed before the problem, and a triggering event that allowed everything to flow together in order to make this policy. When I talk about garbage can model decision making, I always tell folks, I refer to it as Quentin Tarantino decision making because it's non-linear in nature. The solution may actually predate the problem. In rationality and incrementalism, it's always the solution is generated after the problem has been defined. Here, the solution can always be before the problem, and we're taking a solution maybe from decades earlier and applying it to try and address this problem. Welfare reform, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in the mid-1990s, is another example of garbage can model of decision making. The problem that was identified is that successive generations would remain on welfare. And so it's kind of a self-perpetuating type of cycle. We were having difficulty moving people from welfare into the workforce. The solution was the use of a block grant, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families grants, or TANF grants. Those were block grants. We did not invent block grants in 1995 for welfare reform. Block grants had been with us since the FDR administration. So we took something that was decades old and we applied that solution to address a modern day problem. And I think this garbage can model decision making really explains a lot of the way in which we do policy formulation in this country. Again, kind of in that punctuated equilibrium type of an approach. Now, we already talked about why policy formulation is important to administrators. Administrators are involved in policy formulation. They provide advice and consultation to the policy makers through that formulation process. And then even after that policy is passed by the legislative body and signed by a chief executive, it's still then up to administrators to write the rules that will govern then the second phase or the implementation of that policy. So we've got administrators involved both in formulation and then certainly as we transition from formulation into implementation. Now, from your basic civics type of approach to American government, this is the stage where we think that administrators are most active, that they're most active in implementing the laws and the policies passed by elected officials. Now, that's what Woodrow Wilson told us back in 1887. The politics, the policy formulations done by elected officials, the implementation and execution done by administrators. As we know, there's really a bleeding over between the two phases in the role of administrators, both in formulation as well as implementation. But it still falls upon administrators to implement these policies in accordance with the directives that they receive from the elected officials from the policy formulation part of the process. Implementation on face value may seem to be very, very easy to do. Policymakers formulate the policy with some input from administrators. then hand it off to administration, and then organizations and administrators in those organizations then do the day-to-day implementation of that policy. It's not that easy. Implementation is extremely difficult. And implementation can make sure that a policy is not going to be successful. So administrators can stop a policy from succeeding through how they're implementing that policy. There are a lot of barriers out there to effective policy implementation. And you'll talk about these in your policy analysis class, but just quickly for us tonight, some of the primary issues involved in implementation, sometimes there are multiple goals. The goals are not nearly as clear or as singular as we usually like to think of them in civics classes. That really policies may have multiple goals, and those multiple goals may actually conflict with each other. The more decisions that implementers need to make, the less likely implementation is to be successful. So when we have vague legislation and vague policies passed by a legislative body, when they arrive in the administrative agency as those vague policies, administrators have to make a lot of decisions about the nuts and bolts of how to implement that policy. The more decisions implementers need to make to implement a policy, typically the less successful that implementation is going to be. The direction and intensity of the participants in terms of their orientation toward the policy can also be a barrier to implementation. So if you've got implementers, administrators who disagree with the policy and strongly disagree with the policy, then it's going to be difficult to properly implement that policy. Bargaining. Sometimes there's a lot of bargaining that goes on between administrators in the implementation of that policy, and between administrators and citizens in how that policy should be implemented. The more bargaining that's involved in implementation, chances are the less successful that policy will end up being. Sometimes to try and ease the implementation of a policy, policymakers will recreate a new agency solely responsible for the implementation of that policy. The problem with creating a new agency solely responsible for the implementation of a policy is that Congress oftentimes does not adequately fund these new agencies, so they therefore lack the resources they need to properly implement the policy. There's a very famous study that you will cover when you get to 670 by authors named Pressman and Wildavsky. And Pressman and Wildavsky in the 1960s and 70s looked at the implementation of a policy called EDA in Oakland, California. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to identify what are some of the major barriers that precluded successful implementation of this federal policy in this local community of Oakland, California. They literally found dozens upon dozens of barriers to implementation. But one of the primary barriers that they saw was the direction and intensity of the people participating in the implementation of that policy. So according to Pressman and Wildavsky, participants can either have a positive or a negative orientation toward this policy, and they can have different intensities of their orientation. They can either be very strongly opposed, very weakly opposed, very strongly in favor of, very weakly in favor of. So in order to know how successful the implementation will be, you need to know both the direction as well as the intensity of the orientation of the implementer toward the policy itself. So in this table number 1 I have up on the screen, I know it's a little blurry, I apologize for that, but on the left side you have your direction of preference for your implementers, positive or negative. So it's a binary, either they're positive, they support it, or they're negative, they oppose it. Then across your columns, you then have the intensity of that preference. Either they're very strong, very high in terms of their intensity of their feeling toward this policy, or very low, they have a very weak feeling about the policy. Clearly, the best situation you can be in is if you have implementers who are strongly predisposed to supporting the policy. In those situations, according to Pressman and Wildavsky, the policies get implemented with minimal delay and no bargaining whatsoever. It just gets implemented the way in which the legislative body wants it to implement it. So it's a very quick, very clean, very easy type of implementation. That's your best case scenario for implementing a policy. If you have implementers who support the policy, but not terribly strongly, so they're very low on the intensity side of the scale, so they're weakly positive in their orientation, you end up to have some minor delays, but it probably still is going to get implemented. There's not going to be a lot of bargaining. It's going to be slowed down implementation because they're not as incentivized and motivated to implement it as quickly as they normally would be if they were strong supporters. The worst case scenario, obviously, is in the bottom left, where you have a negative orientation among your implementers, and it's a strongly negative orientation. That's where you have maximal delay. That's where you have a lot of bargaining. That's where you have participants bargaining over the very heart, the very essentials of the policy itself. These are situations where the policy is not going to be properly implemented. And then your fourth alternative, negative but a low type of intensity. Moderate delays, you're going to have bargaining, but the bargaining is going to happen over the peripherals, kind of bargaining over the margins of the policy, not really bargaining over the actual essence, the essentials of the policy itself. So your best case situation is your top left-hand cell. Your worst case situation is your bottom left-hand cell. So the direction and intensity of that support or opposition from implementers will have a major impact upon how successful implementation can be. Another one of my favorite authors is Martha Durthick, and she supports the Preston and Waldowski conclusion. She argues that in order to get your implementers to strongly support policy implementation, you need to involve them. You need to involve them in the formulation of the policy so that they have buy-in, so that they have a vested interest in seeing this policy succeed. So what Durthick is arguing for is she's arguing for not just an active role of implementers in implementation, but also an active role for implementers in the actual formulation of that policy. The more you involve your implementers, the more likely they are to support successful implementation. So we formulated the policy, we've set our agendas, we made decisions about what policies will be formulated and what those policies will look like. We then implement those policies. After we've implemented those policies for a while, we then have to move to the next stage of the policy process, which obviously is evaluation. We need to evaluate how well those policies achieve the goals that they were intended to achieve. This evaluation process should provide us with a feedback loop whereby we can take what we learn in evaluation, apply it back to reformulating, redesigning the policy, and also feed that information back into implementation. So sometimes what we'll find in evaluation is there's a problem with the policy design itself. So we have to go back to the formulation stage and redesign that policy. Maybe we selected the wrong alternatives and we'll need to replace those alternatives with other alternatives to make the policy successful. Sometimes we have designed the policies so it flows through the wrong government or through the wrong administrative agency. So we'll have to change that in terms of the design of the policy. Sometimes we'll find out that we're targeting the wrong population. So we have to redesign the policy to target the population that we really want to benefit and the population we really want to serve with that particular public policy. One of the problems with evaluation, well, there are a couple problems. One major problem with evaluation is sometimes we will evaluate policies before they are ready to be evaluated. If we try to evaluate a policy too soon, before it's been fully implemented, it's not ready to be evaluated yet, and it's probably going to look like a failure because it has not been fully implemented. So sometimes we'll do these things called evaluability assessments, where we will literally evaluate the policy to see if it's ready to be evaluated. I know it sounds like the Office of Redundancy, but we evaluate it to make sure it's ready to be evaluated, that we do have some measurable outcomes that we can assess in order to determine just how successful that policy is at achieving the goals that were articulated in the formulation stage of the policy process. Another problem with evaluation is that it requires resources. Evaluations can be costly. There are oftentimes not a lot of political benefit to elected officials to put money behind policy evaluation. Policy evaluation is oftentimes looked at from a very negative perspective, that it uncovers problems that elected officials can then be held accountable for. And so we oftentimes starve evaluation from the necessary resources to do the evaluation process successfully. One primary mechanism we oftentimes use in evaluation: audits. And I'm sure if you work for a local government, you have lived through the auditing process before, where we will evaluate the money that we have spent on these policies and programs as well, to see if we are spending the money in the legally appropriated manner and how well we're spending the money in terms of, are these public taxpayer dollars leading to success with this policy or this program. Two major categories of audits we oftentimes do in the evaluation phase: financial or legal audits versus performance or management audits. In a financial or a legal audit, we're going to be primarily concerned with how that policy was implemented. Was it implemented? Was the money spent in the way in which those monies were supposed to be spent? So oftentimes we design a policy, we will build in requirements for how the resources are spent in the implementation phase. So in a legal or financial audit, we'll make sure that that money was spent in the legally mandated manner that it should be spent during policy implementation. Second category of audits are management or performance audits. In management and performance audits, instead of asking just how did we spend the money, we will ask how well did we spend the money. And this is where we look at the goals. And this is where we look at, did this policy and the money we spent, did it achieve the goals that we initially set out for this policy when we formulated it to begin with? So in performance management-based audits, we're asking the question, how well did we spend the money? In legal financial audits, we're asking the question, how did we spend the money? But in the policy process, we basically go through those phases: formulation, implementation, and evaluation, to make sure that we are not only have designed the policy well, but we're also implementing the policy in a manner in which will help us achieve the goals of that public policy. So as administrators, we are actively involved in formulation, implementation, and evaluation. We are actively involved in all three phases of the policy process. When you get to your 670 policy analysis class, you will talk obviously much more in depth about policy formulation, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. And that course will present you with different strategies and techniques that you can use in analyzing public policies as an administrator. You'll talk about cost effectiveness analysis. You'll talk about cost benefit analysis. You talk about Prince analysis. And there are a lot of different strategies that are used by administrators throughout formulation, implementation, and evaluation. But that's one of the major things we do as administrators. We deal with these public policies, we implement them, and we then evaluate them. But for a public policy to be successful, it must be predicated upon the proper programs that will help us achieve those policy goals. So the specific things we are doing on a daily basis constitute our public programs that we are implementing. So we implement those public programs that will then help us achieve the overall policy goals that we've established back in the policy formulation process. So a second major function that we engage in as public administrators is public program evaluation. We separate our coverage of policy analysis and program evaluation in the MPA program because there are different tools and strategies that you use in policy evaluation compared to program evaluation. Whereas in policy analysis, you will cover that information in your 670 policy analysis course. Program evaluation, you will cover in 696 research methods. And you may ask yourself, why is it called research methods if it covers program evaluation? The course has always been called research methods, and for many years it was taught as classic social science research methods. We found that teaching as classic social science research methods really didn't have a lot of applicability to what we do in the public sector. So instead, we changed the focus of the course and made it more program evaluation. We use a lot of the same methods and skills you learned in research methods, but in 696, we put those skills into the service of evaluating our public programs. And so that's kind of why we separate 670 from 696. So the next thing we do is we evaluate, implement and evaluate these public programs. I don't think we have enough time tonight to go all the way through program evaluation. So I would propose that we kind of end here for this evening. Next week, we'll finish up talking about public program evaluation, again, as a function of public administration. Then we'll move into additional functions of public administration, where we'll get into human resource management in terms of a function, and managing fiscal resources, and then managing performance. Next week, I think, again, we'll do program evaluation and probably be able to get into at least the beginnings of managing human resources. Then the following week, our last week together, we'll be able to do managing fiscal resources and then managing organization performance. So let's stop there for tonight. And again, pick up program evaluation next week. Please do remember that you have your midterm assessment that is due next Monday. Any questions about that midterm assessment, please feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to answer those questions. Remember, keep your answers on the midterm assessment concise and parsimonious. Usually 1 to 2 paragraphs per question will be enough to get the job done. And then you also have your Beach Board essay number 3, comparing public organization to private organizations, 2 similarities and 2 differences between a public organization and a private organization. Questions, observations, or anything about this material we have covered up to this point in time? Okay. So now, because we've covered our theoretical perspectives, you now have all the information that you need for the midterm assessment. This information on policy analysis and program evaluation will then be part of the final assessment. The final assessment is not cumulative, so the final assessment will pick up with policy analysis and then cover throughout the duration of the course. I don't believe in cumulative finals, so it'll just be from policy analysis until the end. Okay? All right, well, there are no other questions or no observations. I think we'll call it an evening. So thank you very much. I'll have this recording up on our Beach Board site no later than tomorrow morning, and look forward to talking to you again next Tuesday. So take care and have a great week.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night,
Good night.
Professor.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.